So with that, actually, let's start out. The first panelist today, Theo. He's also a speaker. In fact, the talk just before this panel at the conference that premiered was Theo's. It was called Buying Time. It was really about the same topic, build versus buy. Theo, why don't you just tell folks a little bit about your name, title, where you work, and 1 minute background.
Yeah, of course. I'm Theo. I used to work at Twitch. I now run a company called Pink. We just did the Y Combinator Winter 22 batch. TLDR, we're making it easier to do collaborative live content, especially for streamers, YouTube creators, things like that. The talk was mostly about how I make decisions around long-term investments in technologies, as I've worked at a big company like Twitch and moved over a bunch of things from the bad early decisions to good later decisions. And now I'm in a position to do that again, as well as helping other startups. So I think a lot about not just what technology makes today better, but what technology makes tomorrow easier.
Thank you. Okay, next up is Mahela from Valtech. Mahela, why don't you tell us, name, title. I mentioned where you work. You're also a Mock Alliance ambassador, and just 1 minute about your background.
I am. Thanks, Ishan. So Mahela Mazang, I'm CTO for Valtech North America, and I have about 15 years in the SaaS platform development space, and also some time on the commerce side at Sharper Image as their ex-CTO. So ton of experience building commodity SaaS offerings and also buying them and composing them.
Great, thank you. Next up is Chris from commercetools. Chris, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure thing. Hey guys, my name is Chris Hough. I'm a solutions architect at commercetools. And commercetools, for those of you that don't know, is a commerce portfolio company that kind of kicked off the composability within commerce. Most of my time is spent working with customers that have already bought into the composability concept and bringing them on board to commercetools. But we do deal a lot with which components to decide on building versus buying. I've also spent the greater part of the last 15 years or so in the architecture consulting role on SaaS platforms. So happy to be here, excited about this subject.
Great, thanks, Chris. And then rounding it out is Ellery, who leads Director of Engineering for the Edgio Expert Services team. Ellery, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks, it's great to meet everyone. As Ishan said, I'm Ellery. I work at Edgio Expert Services. So I'm the Director of Engineering for AppOps Expert Services. My group helps customers build high-performance websites using Jamstack architectures and specifically composable architectures for the e-commerce vertical. So we focus on building headless websites that are high converting and passing, in many cases, highly exceeding core web vitals. We've helped customers achieve 99 Lighthouse scores on their websites. So we're very focused on performance. So looking forward to the conversation. It's great to meet everyone.
Great. So let me actually start off with the unexpected. What do you think is, and we'll get to how you decide on build versus buy, but what do you think is the biggest misconception you see when teams first jump headfirst on an API first or composable stack, that they either have misaligned expectations and how that translates potentially into build versus buy? And Mahela, I'll start with you, since you've actually helped lead teams through this in multiple contexts.
So number one, I think that the concept itself, although maybe not new to us, and large, right, is still going through a period of adoption. So having APIs does not mean that you're API first, and you have to really understand what that means and why that's important. And I also don't think that having composition in places doesn't mean that you have a composable stack. So those are two very different animals, and it's incredibly easy to get the architecture, orchestration, integration wrong, and quite honestly end up with a monolith via composable and APIs anyways and microservices. So I think you need a champion an expert on your team, whether you also buy that or build that through internal expertise, to really carry forward the sense of what true composability means.
I'll turn it to you as a follow-up, or anybody else on the panel. Is there a litmus test for when you're truly composable? I like that concept of you may have thought you built it composable, but you ended up with a monolith anyway. There's a suggestion of how you can evaluate that. So you know
I'd say that
yeah.
Say the most important piece is that the inputs and outputs for any given part are standardized enough that you swap it out. Something like Hasura, I wouldn't consider composable in any way, shape, or form, because the thing that is storing your data is its own standard that you have no access to. But the thing you're accessing that data through GraphQL is a standard in the vaguest sense of this is a way to define an API, but it's not a standard in the sense that that's an API you can take and port to other things. Like I have had more luck moving from Postgres to MySQL. Hell, I've had more luck moving from Worker TV to MySQL than I've had doing anything on an old Hasura-based code base.
Interesting. And I know, one of the concepts you talked about in previous episodes of JavaScript Jam Live, but you didn't mention it in your buying time talk. You have an analogy you're famous called the ship of theosis. Do you want to just explain that rule of thumb to folks? Because I think that really dovetails nicely to what you just described.
Yeah, I'm a really big fan of any given piece being replaceable, because as much as you think you know when you make a decision, isn't necessarily going to hold as you keep going. So I really like to think in terms of how expensive is this to adopt, but more importantly, how expensive is it for us to move off this in the future? The ship of theosis is a meme that the community's come up with where like every piece in the stack can and often should be replaced when new things come out and different solutions happen. Like the code base for Ping, for example, started as a styled component Vite code base that I moved over to Tailwind, Next.js, TRPC. I moved the data from Worker KV to Postgres on RDS, to Postgres on Heroku, where I stayed for like a day before I realized my mistake and moved over to RDS, eventually moving over to PlanetScale with MySQL. But the ability to swap any one of these parts at any given time is one of the most valuable parts of composability. Rather than having to rewrite the whole code base when you run into problems, you rewrite the parts that are causing the problems.
Do you want to explain the Greek, parable for those who aren't familiar with it?
Yeah, of course. It's the meme is based on the ship of Theseus parable, the idea of a ship traveling the waters and parts keep breaking and being replaced. If once you've replaced every part of that ship, is it still the same ship?
Yeah, I think it's a really good way to think about composability and
does
very
the
tangible,
ship
memorable.
need TypeScript? Does TypeScript help the ship transition?
I'll then turn it over to Chris. What do you think? Especially you mentioned you have a lot of folks who come to you guys maybe a little further on the composability maturity curve or headless curve. Do you still see common misconceptions, or what do you need to educate prospects and customers about as they embark on this journey?
Yeah, from a couple different points. From the platform or product side, I think composability, if your features and functionality is coupled such that you need to utilize a specific module on your platform for other functionality, then you're going to have a tough time calling yourself composable. On the customer side, so if we're looking about implementing composable solutions, I do see a lot of customers that come from the monolith space, and their technology teams from an architecture and development standpoint want to mimic all of kind of the business entities and functionality that they see or that they're currently using on their monolith. And I'll give you an example is that, for commercetools from a commerce perspective, you want your front end application to be your storefront front end application to be as performant as possible. But a lot of these customers coming from these monoliths try to stuff in all of the data for the product catalog that they're used to having, right? So your front end storefront application doesn't care about your order fulfillment, right? That should be completely decoupled.
Got it. That's a really interesting kind of tangible example. I'll then turn it over to you, Ellery. What do you see as the common misconception when folks are trying to migrate to a composable stack?
I think Halo made a really good point about what does it really mean to be API driven. And a good example here is if you think about Shopify, for example, which is an out-of-the-box e-commerce platform, and you can build headless websites on it using Hydrogen or the Storefront API, but there are a lot of customers who just use the traditional Shopify theme, and that's an API. They give you clear documentation for how to integrate with it, but now your UI is tightly coupled with the platform. And you made a comment about Legos earlier, that you want to build your composable stack out of Lego blocks. In a past life, we used to explain this a little bit differently, where we would show them a picture of different colored Play-Doh in a ball, and then a picture of Lego blocks, and just tell them, we're trying to take you from Play-Doh to Lego. Let's make sure nothing is tightly coupled. You can very easily replace components as much as possible, and as much as possible, avoid building things that are unnecessary. Don't go build wrapper API layers on top of third-party components in case you might swap them out because you're worried about one of the API interfaces changing. Try to grow organically and smartly, and pick things that are easy to, swap things out of. And I think from a composable standpoint, you really want to try to go pick what are the, best products for you. There's no such thing as the best e-commerce product or the best content management system or, the best inventory management system, MarTech product, etc. So go find what works best for you and your team, glue it together through a headless framework like Svelte, Next, Nux, get something out the door ASAP. And if you do that, you're set up so that, if you run into a scale problem with one of your products or you realize something doesn't really meet your needs, it's pretty straightforward to go rewrite that part of the application. Just change the interface and migrate your content over.
That's actually a good seg to the build versus buy. So now we're at you're basically advocating to take a very agile, progressive, incremental approach. Build some piece of viable value first, rather than a big bang rewrite to totally de-risk it, if I'm to extrapolate. When customers or prospects do that, first to Ellery, and then I guess next to Hyla for you, since you advise a lot of folks through Valtech. Where do you see customers, deciding on build versus buy? What are the rubric or the rules or litmus tests they use to decide which components that at the end deciding if to build in that process and which ones do they buy?
Yeah, so let's talk about e-commerce specifically for a minute. If you're in that industry, performance is a really important thing to you. Backend flexibility, less so important, but you want to make sure you have a very fast website. It's very clean. Users don't feel a sluggish experience. You want them to come back, and you want them to convert at a very high rate. So for a lot of our customers, we tend to emphasize build the front end that meets all of your needs and use composable building blocks for the back end, whether it's open source and you can see how it's built, or they're very transparent with how they work. That's probably less of a concern. And we've helped customers build websites that do hundreds of millions ARR, over $1 billion ARR, with a lot of off-the-shelf components comprising their backend, and just a open source front-end framework gluing everything together, hosted on a platform like Layer 0, for example. So I don't think there's a strong inflection point where you need to go start building things, especially on the back end. It really comes down to when do you need to be a differentiator in the market. And for an e-commerce company or for a startup, I think getting time to market, getting visibility to your customers is really important. If you're building a platform, then it becomes very different, right? Because now your differentiator is the features you provide. Your performance becomes a differentiator as well, down to milliseconds. Whereas for a lot of other customers, that's not really the place you're in right now. So I think for the vast majority of people who, if you're e-commerce and you're thinking about adopting a headless architecture, and really adopting Mach, for example, I would strongly recommend build as little as possible aside from your front end. Because if you use a site builder, you're not going to get good front end performance. But everything else, try to find what works best for your teams and build off of that.
Interesting. So it's basically, if I was to summarize it, buy for everything except where your differentiation is, and that's where you focus where to build.
Correct.
Okay. Mihaila,
I think Theo has
the
his hand up.
Mock-aligned-
Just FYI.
Oh, Theo, go ahead. Yeah.
I think I mostly agree, but there are some like, I don't know the right way to put this. I
love when panels disagree because that's when you get the most interesting discussion. So feel free to disagree. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Believe me, I'm incapable of not disagreeing when I disagree. So I think that when your situation is simple enough that you have like a single differentiator, I don't know if that's the point where I would start betting on composability, where like if the other parts of your stack are simple enough, then thinking about them at all almost feels like a wasted investment. Like if I am trying to build an e-commerce storefront, yeah, absolutely. So hop into Next.js or Hydrogen. And then when you need like the back end, those frameworks aren't just front end frameworks. I get in this argument a lot. Next.js is a back end framework. It happens to have a really good front end built into it, but it is back end. It serves you HTML or Java or JSON from a server. It is a really good starting point to be that layer when you do need to make a back end call. And I think that people, once they are in Next.js and they need something that looks like a backend, they start reaching for Nest.js or Hasura or all these other things. When Next.js actually provides everything they need right there, just write a server function, write 100 server functions, write 1,000 of them. And once you run into a scaling issue with that framework, the functions you wrote are just JavaScript functions that are Express compliant. You can port them to anything else in the world. So I think that like Next.js isn't just good as a way to like build the front end and then figure out which API service to buy after. It's a great place to build that API service as well. And if your API is simple enough that you can work with one of those like third-party providers like a Hasura or a Firebase, you should not and instead own that thing because it's so much cheaper to have it in the same code base.
I completely agree with that. I would definitely advise people just use Next routes or Next routes to build your APIs. Don't go overboard and say, oh, I've heard of Kubernetes. That sounds great. We need to go spin up EKS or AKS or whatever KS, depending on your cloud provider. Now you're just bringing in a lot of operational overhead to manage a Kubernetes cluster. There's costs associated with it. It's not going to be elastic, so you're going to pay for this stuff at night when no one's browsing your product. And it just adds unnecessary complexity.
Totally agree. I was going to make a joke about Kubernetes earlier. I'm genuinely curious how many of the like e-commerce places that you're advising are on Kubernetes because that just sounds like a disaster.
No comment.
So is there a common, and I'll open this up to Chris and Mihaila as well. Is there a common set of, components that you can point to and you'd say greater than 50% of the people we've worked with, they ended up buying this thing because they don't feel like building it themselves, whether it's, database hosting or the payment system. Like, where do you see most commonly people decide to build that component and where do they buy? Or is that you can't actually draw those lines? There isn't any commonality.
Please tell me nobody's building payment systems anymore.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with that. So payments, 100%, I would say, definitely greater than 50%, but close to 100%. But even some of the other things that are, almost commodities, but not and difficult to implement, but not difficult to integrate with, like search. Greater than 50% of our customers are also hooking up with some sort of search provider alongside the payment.
Mihaila, go ahead. Are there other ones you'd add to that?
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of undertones here that I agree with, and I think you want to buy commodity, right? I think it's different. Today is different than it was many years ago because there just weren't as many commodities to buy. So I think the ecosystem looks very different today, and that there are a lot of incredible cost-effective options for brands or clients, et cetera, to really harness so they can focus on their core business needs. So I think the closer the tech gets to the customer is probably where you're going to be more creative. But I think it also underlines in where do you need scale? So truly, you can build, small features that are likely to not get used by a large customer base. But if you actually need an incredible amount of scale, even as it applies to the front end, then you're likely still getting into buy conversations versus build. So for me, it's truly about maturity. Of course, wouldn't want to build a payment system, but who knows why somebody would want to take that option. And it's all about maturity and what the business actually needs. So focus on what you need to drive value for the business and buy everything else.
How much, you mentioned scale, how much does maintenance play a factor here? And I bring this up because it may be tempting for some folks to say, here is an open source version of something. And maybe there's a hosted version of it, maybe there's not, that's been productized, but it can be very tempting to say, oh, we can just adopt this and maintain it ourselves. Have you seen that work out well? How important is, adopting a product that has an open core or open source component to it in this decision?
I mean, if you are adopting an open source product into your composition that you need to maintain, is different than purchasing a product that has open source as part of its framework. It matters a lot. Again, I'm advocating for you to focus on what's unique to your business, and probably maintenance is not going to make it on that list. So, and that's part of the reason, an additional part of the reason why you buy, because all of that maintenance is offloaded to a SaaS company. It's no longer keeping you up at night, and you can spend that time on a much higher level of execution for the organization.
Yeah, and I would say, you probably couldn't get me onto an airplane where the computers are running Windows as the operating system. But at the same time, I don't look too closely behind the curtain at how a lot of these SaaS and PaaS products are built. I focus a lot more on uptimes, SLAs, performance, and these types of indicators.
Theo, I believe you look closely at this in your decision making. Do you have a different take in terms of how important that it's got an open core is? Because I know you talked earlier about being able to migrate off, and maybe open source, at least having an open core, gives you some kind of mitigation plan or escape strategy if you need it.
Rather than an open core, I look more for standards on top and bottom. Like I think that PlanetScale is a really interesting example here, where they are, I guess, an open core in the sense that like Vitesse is the core of their whole business and like the tech that they ship, but it is not necessarily the part I think about. And there are like nice DX wins and general deployment stories, like greatness overall. So I never have to worry about the scale of my DB. But if I ever did, or I was having problems with PlanetScale, or the price was to spike in a way that was unpleasant, it is still MySQL. I can still do a MySQL dump off it and move to something else. The standard that it's on top of is one that I understand and am confident enough in to make the move if I ever have to. I don't necessarily look for open cores, although like they do help me build stronger like confidence. What I look for is open standards on top. There are plenty of things with open cores, like I think it was EdgeQL. No, it wasn't EdgeQL. That's actually cool. There was some EdgeDB that was entirely open source, but the core team just shut down one day. They all left. And if you had bet on that database, sure, it's open source. You can maintain it yourself. But now when you were betting on something because you thought it would be easier to use, now you're maintaining an open source library to keep using it.
That's the long-term viability of the service. And that's something you mentioned in your talk that went, was on the conference earlier today. That really puts it in sharp relief. Let's move on to call it the more soft or, considerations. How much does it matter, the ecosystem and hiring and team preferences around a particular technology when you're trying to figure out what goes into the stack in terms of buy versus build? And, especially when you've got maybe a team that's, gung-ho about building things and it just sounds exciting to use whatever might be a hot buzzword like Kubernetes. How do you, shape putting into the right perspective whether it really is a realistic idea to say, hey, we're going to build all the things?
I think you had a twofold question in there, Ishan. In terms of the people, I'm a strong believer that I expect people to learn new things. So prior knowledge in a specific tech means almost absolutely nothing to me, because I also expect that it will change. 5 years from now, we're going to be talking about something different. But in terms of preparing the team for a new paradigm, you have to have really strong learning and development programs that you can tap into to make sure that they're learning something that has a very specific point of view as set by the organization, and that it's consistent, and you're going to get the same level of quality of the learning program and the message for each individual. Again, right, you really need that advocate internally that does understand the paradigm that you're moving to well, to be able to disseminate that and really be a champion within the org for it.
Thank you.
I think from an offering standpoint, from a platform, I think it's important not just to be unopinionated, but especially if you're new, you have to make it easy for the developers and users out there to get on, right? So is it possible to create SDKs across the board on different languages so that you don't require that your potential customers specialize or upskill just to onboard?
You mentioned, Mahila, this idea that you need to have a, training and onboarding program. You've worked with a lot of companies at different scales. Just outline what that might look like, just to make it more concrete for the audience.
I suppose it all depends on the type of transformation that you're after. So let's recognize, I think all of the speakers here look like they come from SaaS backgrounds. So it's very different from an organization that has been on a monolith for 20 years, because it also means something very different to the ways of working and their level of agility. So I think the approach that you take to create the program has to be really specific to the team that you understand that you have, their learning styles, and ultimately your end goal. But I'm certainly a fan of hands-on type of learning and development. So, create a fictional POC that encompasses all of the technologies that you're targeting, and pass it over to the team in a guided manner and have them build something in 30, 60, 90 days. I don't know that in periods of transformation that you're going to get anything more effective than that, because we all know that hands-on learning is always exceptional to reading.
This brings up, I think, a baseline question we should have started with at the beginning. And by the way, we're past the halfway point, so feel free to raise your hand. We'll bring you up to the stage, and we can start having audience questions for the panel. But the question that maybe we should have raised earlier is, especially for Ellery, Chris, and Mahila, you guys have helped a lot of companies get through it. I think, Theo, you've been in a case where it was, I think, what I'd call a net new, building from scratch. But where you're taking an existing company and you're trying to migrate them over or help them migrate to composability, what's the range of times you've seen that actually take in terms of months or weeks or quarters, typically for a customer to get, say, let's call it the first unit of output that's composable, not necessarily migrating the whole stack?
Highly variable in my opinion. And again, I think that it all depends on who you can leverage within the organization to move that initiative forward, and their expertise and their background. But the biggest question also is, how do you not get yourself in the same position again in 20 years? So it's really, are you building a culture of innovation? Do you understand what that means? So it's constant, it's iterative, it's curious. And if you haven't had that, it's probably why you've stagnated for 20 years on the same type of technology. So this is more of a culture shift, and it takes more than just tech to transform. And a lot of that equation is people. So it also depends on how fast the organization can move in a transformation. So if they can move fast, right, you're looking at 3-4 months. If they can't move fast, then you're looking at 2 years.
Great.
Yeah,
That,
that's why they
go ahead,
actually
Chris.
say it's entirely the number of people. That's like it's the people and their willingness more than the tech itself, almost always.
Yeah, I will agree with both of those points. I can provide an example. We have had a very large retailer go live with a small subset of their purchases on their commerce platform, but within 4 months, right? And they did so migrating off of a custom-built AS400 solution. But I think that's one of the tenets of a composable solution, right? Is that you are able to have such a small feature set or such a decoupled feature set that you can use a Strangler pattern, even though you're coming from a monolith. All they need to do is build out the services in between to communicate, right? So this company actually came on board and was accepting orders just using checkout, right? So they had that tangible thing live within 4 months that they could use as kind of their starting point.
Wow. So AS400, that must have been a manufacturer probably, huh? I was going to, Bro Nifty wanted to come up and ask a question, I think, here. What's
yes,
up?
thank you. Yeah, I wanted to touch on the maybe shill a little bit for current fad, interest, buzzword of the Kubernetes thing. I would say that, and this kind of ties into what the analogy Theo's ship of, I don't remember, I'm not like a classical guy.
Theo.
Yes, that amazing story. It kind of ties in to Theo's story on the like infrastructure data pipelines side of things. So I would say Kubernetes is not something that you'd need for a startup that's going to build like a product to go direct to consumer, or even like e-commerce or streaming or anything like that. You wouldn't need it. But if you're like an older, mature company that uses data to make business decisions, like you need, executive dashboards and like doing a bunch of analytics and data warehousing, maybe machine learning and like doing all these kinds of things deep, and you have like a whole bunch of analysts and stuff like that, that's when you would need like data pipelines, business intelligence, data warehousing, and cloud was from on-prem to cloud was the 2000s to 2010s, or to mid 2010s, 2015 or so. But then more recently, the shift is going to Kubernetes, and what it does is it takes the emphasis off the particular cloud where you have vendor lock-in, like whether it's AWS, Google, Azure, or one of the other ones, and it abstracts it out like the Lego blocks, where you can have one Kubernetes logical layer on top of one or the other cloud or multiple clouds, and you can swap out the components or whatever. It doesn't matter. Once you put it on Kubernetes, it's a build once, run anywhere kind of platform for that, for pipelines and stuff like that. So that's all I want to say.
That's also a great case where you can buy that now. So Kubernetes, it was certainly a part of a massive transformation that we did, and it has its place. It's a mature tool, and also if we're talking about self-managed Kubernetes, I mean, right, you're in for a lot of long nights. So again, the more mature the tech is, the more you have to configure. It's advisable that you go a different route if you don't have a team to support that.
I like the point that was made earlier, the idea of like, what are your differentiators? If you're not selling developer tools and your company isn't directly facing like developers trying to solve weird infra problems, you probably shouldn't be solving weird infra problems with things like Kubernetes. Like Kubernetes is a great tool for those specific problems if that's the problem space that you live in. But very few people here, statistically speaking, are going to be in that problem space. The average developer faces users, not other devs. And those technologies are much better for when the dev teams are facing dev teams, are facing dev teams, are facing another company's dev team.
I think we have another person from the audience. Jacob, did you have a question for the panel?
Yeah, kind of a question / statement. On Also, what's up, Theo?
Howdy, howdy. What's up,
so,
Jacob?
Hey, Anthony. I guess one thing I'd throw out there is what would be everybody's take here for things like, I guess it's kind of a newish concept. So you have like the Cloudflare Workers developer platform, and then the like Sunil put it way better, and Theo probably has more context on this with his conversations with Sunil Pai, who I work with, is along the lines of like the platform as a service for platforms as a service. Kind of like just like buying, like you're buying a way to build for other people that are building for people to buy.
The way Sunil put it, and we're still like working on words for it, was service as a platform. So rather than like you buy something that has a database and then you call that database with your database client, instead you might buy something with a database in their web system, write a quick JavaScript function that outputs whatever format you specifically need, and then you call that from the database system. So it's like, what is the in-between of database as a service and GraphQL as a service? It's database as a service with a service on top where you can write your own custom code. And that's a trend that we're starting to see more of, things like the Supabase function, things like Cloudflare's data store. Like from both sides, we're seeing the convergence of the platforms and the services almost inversely from how we're used to. And it is an interesting trend. I would argue a lot of the companies doing this are doing it because it forces more buy-in in a space where there wasn't any. Like a Planet Scale has a kind of fragile ground right now, because if your company gets big enough and or like the price of Planet Scale gets too high for you, you can move off somewhat trivially because all the core pieces are open source and the standards are pretty standard too. But if I built half my company's APIs literally inside a Planet Scale GUI, I'm screwed.
It's a form of lock-in. Is what you're basically, you see this sometimes with AWS. If you've got a million different services across AWS, you've maybe set up, and then having to migrate off all of that, it's just service by service is going to be a bit of work.
Well, there's also like SDKs, because if you think of like, you could use Supabase just for Postgres, and then you could port that anywhere you want that supports Postgres. So if you build everything around Supabase SDK, then all of a sudden your code is no longer portable.
Yeah.
But this feels like a question for, I think people who are building platforms for others, so to speak. Is that an accurate statement here compared to, I probably said it in the panel earlier, but the closer the tech gets to the user or the customer, that's where you focus, and the rest you kind of abstract away. And so if you are, really close to the customer as a business, and you're not building a platform for somebody else to get close to the customer, it feels like, that's the litmus test you would use here. If your customer is somebody building a platform, then you worry about this. If your customer is an actual user, then you don't worry about this. Would that be a fair statement?
Yeah. So it's actually what I was really coming up here to emphasize was there was a lot of conversation that was kind of really leaning towards and favoring like the idea that the user, quote unquote, is going to be some sort of customer client, somebody at the other end of a e-commerce or blog website or whatever it may be. Whereas like a lot of the people that say like are quote unquote users for like the stuff that I'm building right now at Cloudflare, they're engineers, right? And so it's like we still have to keep the same things in mind though. Like we have to consider UX or DX, whatever you want to call it. We have to consider like how abstract we want to make it or how low level we want to make it. Like these are all the same. Like how much of it do they really want to build and how much do they want to buy? So.
Yeah, it's actually a really important and interesting point. One that's near and dear, to my heart personally, because what we do in my day job for Edgeo is we build products for developers. Like our customers are developers. I think most of the folks in this audience are developers. And so, that's a different set of users and different set of concerns. And you're right that, you know, the the way we've laid this out is really about the consideration of build versus buy for that audience and not for the people who are building platforms for developers. It's kind of like that old story of like, they say, what does the world sit on? It sits on, I think, some turtles, or an elephant that sits on turtles. And then the question is, what's below that? It's like turtles all the way down. And so it's that layer beneath. And so it is another area of dimension of consideration that I think we haven't really touched on, but it's worth noting, and definitely one that's near and dear to our heart as well. Theo,
I try my best to frame this as like people who are facing users that aren't developers, and I've always felt like developers think as though their customers are developers too a little too often, so I try to intentionally push really hard the other direction. Back to like the service of the platform and how that fits here though. If you're a developer company facing developers, especially if you're facing newer developers or adoption problems because your stuff involves too much buy-in on the other person's side, things like adding the ability to write like JavaScript in a REPL to transform that data shape as like a service on top of your platform are nice wins on that side, and I get why the developer companies are doing it because it increases lock-in, which obviously they want, and it like reduces friction to make the thing work the first time in like a demo or a getting started project, stuff like that. It helps those companies get adopted more easily, and it makes it harder to move off of them in the future. On the other side, though, if you're a company that's facing users, how do you decide if you should use one of these new things? I think it depends largely on what the expectations for that project are and how bad the cost is of having to, like, are you going to use this for two functions that are never going to change, or are you going to use this for all of your functions in a code base that's going to grow from 2 developers to 20? I think that's really like what my talk was meant to be about. Those types of functions have really low buy-in costs, but normal like medium maintenance costs, and then really high buy-off costs. So you have to be conscious of that as you make the decision if you're not building a developer platform. But yeah, if you're Cloudflare, go build a bunch of this shit. It's going to make people really happy and it's going to make you a lot of money. But on the other side, be careful when you bet on these things.
So let me then turn this over to, Mihaela and bring Mihaela, Chris, and Ellery in. When you're making a decision on buy versus build, how much does the developer experience that the people who are creating the platforms have created matter in the decision?
I mean, it matters a lot. Of course, it depends on what you're buying, because not all things that you buy will necessarily matter in a developer experience. But again, right, those are certainly things that aren't part of your core business. So buying something that has an incredible developer experience, again, to get quality and consistency and efficiency for the team, should absolutely be a target.
Yeah, that developer experience is dollars, right? If you have to invest a certain amount of time to build something, it's going to be easier for your team to build it. They want to use that platform and they're emotionally invested in it, then that's a value add in that case. Now, if it's contradictory to the business needs, then you shouldn't do it. And you see that sometimes where the tech team is heart set on using some tool or some framework when really there's no business alignment, and you need to make the right decision there and not do that. And this goes back to Mihaela's point that you should find people who are smart and eager to learn. It's not always about picking the new shiny thing. Sometimes you need to pick something more reliable or learn something new because you have a tool looking for a solution and you need to flip that around.
Do you often see that the products that people will buy into the stack rather than build themselves, I would imagine, have a better developer experience? Because one of the things a company around a service can do, in addition to maintain it and add new features to it, is also invest in the better developer experience. And that's where teams might think, oh, I'll build this thing, but if you buy it, it'll actually have so much less friction and so much more productivity than if you had to build it yourself. There's a graphic, I think it was one of these, I think it was actually bytes.dev, who has a really great newsletter. They they had an example of a painting. This is what happens when you buy a service, and then when you try to build it yourself, it was like somebody hand drawed the face. That's always really stuck with me. It's like, which would you rather use? Do you feel that it's a usual rubric, or is that not always the case?
I don't know if that's the usual rubric per se. Oftentimes if you're buying a solution, it's because if you didn't do that, you would need to go buy and configure a bunch of, point products and manage them, handle orchestration, et cetera. This goes back to, we all want to avoid Kubernetes if we can. So if you look at something like Edgio App Platform or Cloudflare Workers, like sure, you could go find a hosting platform for JavaScript, manage scalability, et cetera. But do you really want to do that? Do you want to be on the hook for disaster recovery, high availability, patching, security, et cetera? Or based on where your scale is today, should you just go buy a product that works out of the box? You have a bit of vendor lock-in, but if your business 10x's or 100x's, then you can look at bringing that in-house. But do you need to do that right now? And almost always the answer is no, you don't need to do that right now.
Ellery and Aishan, I guess what you really need is the right person in the room to make those decisions the proper way. And really employ true tech strategy in terms of, how is it that your business is going to harness technology to bring value? So unfortunately, that's sometimes counter to what a developer might think. And, the world and the business is bigger than all of us. So you need to have the right technical leadership to have those conversations and to lead the team towards the right decisions.
So you need to be in the room where it happens. That's what you got to do.
Yeah.
Well, you need to be objective, right? This isn't about using the latest and greatest tools. It's not about picking something that will look great on your resume, right? We're always in pursuit of meeting business objectives, and we need to stay mindful of that.
I think also, especially if you're building something or part of a composable ecosystem, right? I think part of that is, the partnerships for the different parts that function together. We have a lot of customers using integrations partners such as Valtech, right? And they bring the expertise across the board for the different components that can help, right? So you're not reliant on your internal resources to upskill quickly and learn all of these different components right off the bat.
That's a really good call out. Do you find that, when customers are migrating to a composable architecture or they're doing build versus buy, that there's a temptation, especially if they come from, shall we say, a more legacy mindset, that it just feels like too many services, though, the flip side of that. And there's a temptation to try to buy all the services from one? Or is it very clear they're like, we don't want to put all eggs in one basket, and they very much they're trying to overcompensate for that?
What I have seen is a kind of a sequential composability, right? So maybe they're just buying the initial components. Well, personal experience here, they come and buy commercetools, right? And they start their migration plan. And then we get through kind of solutioning with them and make the determination, you're going to want to replace your, your search functionality or your product catalog management, right? So it's not. I don't see a lot of customers really going all out and purchasing so many different components that they're overdoing it. It's more of a sequential. They may get two or three off the bat, but it would be more of a iterative approach, I would think.
You mentioned the Strangler pattern earlier. Do you want to just explain that to the audience who may not have heard of it?
Yeah, and it comes from an old article that an architect, I can't remember his name, came up with about the Strangler Fig, which is a tree in Southeast Asia that kind of nests in the top of existing trees and then drops its roots down, right? So the analogy here is that your solution, especially coming off of monolith, is you would take the approach of breaking out features components and slowly replacing the monolith features and components with those. So eventually, you strangle it out and kill the whole thing off.
Yeah, I think that was smart and follow. Mahai, I think you wanted to add something, but go ahead.
Word of caution. Strangulation is a more mature model. And at some point, you have to end it and you have to be complete because you run a very, very high risk. If you're not mature enough to employ that model of then being stuck in the middle, and now you're running both your old systems and your new systems. So I know there's this notion kind of in the marketplace that nobody likes Big Bang. I think that's a very individual decision of how you approach that transformation. And strangulation could be the appropriate choice, but recognize you need the end goal and you need to be accountable to getting to the end goal, because otherwise you will create a massive mess for your organization.
I completely agree with that, and I'm sorry if we just have a minute. So the concern there is that a lot of these customers migrating off of monoliths or legacy tech, that stuff is so ingrained that it is difficult to strangle off the features and build out the components and while keeping the rest of it running.
Yeah. So we do have 2 minutes left, just to be mindful of all the panelists' time. But I know that Jason did come up here to, I believe, ask a quick question. If possible, we would like to allow for that.
No, I didn't have a quick question, but I'll yield back my time.
Or a statement.
Someone else wants to make a quick question.
Oh, okay.
Quick pro tip for Sean and Scott. Twitter Spaces tend to take about half an hour to an hour to ramp up and let's get their core audience. It might be worth finding a way to structure these where there's like an hour of just chit chat, then like the meet and out like at that hour point. If you can find a way to do that in the future, it might help with
I've noticed that throughout these that near the end we really start getting excited. People start going at it. But either way.
That's really good advice. Well, we only have basically a minute left. So I'll just say thank you to all the panelists for the discussion today, and really encourage everyone to check out composability.dev and hand it over to Scott to take us out.
Awesome. Well, I just want to thank again all the panelists for coming up here, as Ishan said, and joining us today. Really some wonderful conversations had, and maybe like Theo said, we should plan something out in the near future to do maybe a couple hours just in the calendar. It may not go that long, but hey, it may. And so there could be some really good conversations had that could create thought leadership throughout, the niche that we're in and what we're trying to accomplish here, and just really improving the lives of developers and businesses as well. So thank you so much.
For customers.
Absolutely. Yes, that is definitely at the forefront. So thank you so much for everybody. Thank you for joining us here at JavaScript Jam Live. Don't forget, we do this every Wednesday from 12 to 1 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. So if you want to join us again, please jump in. We would love to hear more about this. As far as scheduling more panel stuff out, I'm sure we'll be doing that more in the future too. But typically we have this open mic kind of conversation, which these do turn into, which is even the panel one, yes, it had a category that we're on, but I think it really went well. So either way, thank y'all so much for joining us today, and we will see you next week. And don't forget to go to composability.dev and register to be a part of this community, because we're creating this awesome community here. We've grown so much. We've grown from 80-something people on JavaScript Jam to well over 450 today within just a few months. So keep it up. Keep sharing. If you got value from any of the speakers up here, please feel free to follow them. Click on their face, follow, because if they're on anywhere else, that, well, you're probably going to get value from them there too. All right. So thank y'all and appreciate it. And we'll see you in the next one. All right, coming back in for the outro music if you want it. If not, then leave the room.
My favorite part.
Here it comes. Yeah. All right, y'all. See you next time.